Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Hands-On CISO podcast. My name is Adi, and today we'll be talking to Christopher Russell. Christopher has been in the security field for over a decade, and today is the CISO of tZERO Group. Christopher, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How you doing?
Amazing. So, do you prefer Chris or Christopher?
I go by Chris, Christopher, or Russell. Being in the military, I'm used to being called just about anything.
That's perfect. Okay,
And there's
so
always a lot of Chris's in an organization, so I'm like, everyone can call me Russell if it makes it easier.
perfect. Okay, so, well, I'm not sure now. Let's call you Russell
There we
so
go.
you feel at home.
There you go. Go right at home.
So, Russell, how did you end up being a CISO? What was your journey like?
Actually going back to the military, I was in the intelligence part of it. And then after the military, I was a civilian doing intelligence work. And one thing became really apparent, not just working alongside classified information, but also trying to obtain other countries' classified information, is we were really abysmal at network security and system security. And literally everyone was kind of spying on everyone and no one was catching it. And it was just really, cybersecurity was just in a really poor state. So when the Intel side started to get a little political for me, as you kind of move up the ranks, I decided to kind of transfer out. And I thought, seems like there might be some job security in the cybersecurity thing, considering how bad everyone is at it. So.
Amazing. And have you worked in many different industries within this as a security professional?
Sure. I started off as a regular kind of network type engineer on firewalls with Fortinets and Palo Altos and Cisco ASAs and things like that. Kind of working like a SOC as an engineering piece in the background. And I've also worked for VAR, Critical Start, in several different capacities, but, kind of managing customer setups, deployments, maintaining their back end of things like, Splunk and their EDR tools and the monitoring of alerts and things like that. So I've kind of been one of the guys working on the back end of that, making sure all the alerts are coming in correct and make sure everything's configured right. And then you get a fair amount of time hearing how customers do or don't like certain things over time. So it's kind of a good experience, I would say. Everyone in the cybersecurity field, I think at some point should be customer facing because you get a lot more information. You learn a lot more about it. Your environment, if you're not really seeing much, can be kind of quiet. But if you work for any sort of VAR or MSSP or MDR, you kind of get a lot of, fire hose worth of data thrown at you. And then after that, I moved over to tZERO where, I became the CISO. And so kind of a quick little jaunt, but I feel like in the middle, I did, a fair amount leading up to it.
Interesting. I think it's the first time that a CISO told me about that a CISO should be customer facing, like should have experience in that. Why do you think that affected, or what do you think is important about that for a security
You hear a lot
professional?
of different stakeholder kind of needs and wants and concerns that you might not have thought of, and you may not even have as an organization yet, but then you may obtain later on. So for example, you're working for, different financial vectors and you have oil and gas vectors. All these people have like kind of different wants, needs, and concerns, and things that are important to them and important to their boards. And the more things you hear about that and how they want the data and what the things are really scared about, I think the better you're prepared if all of a sudden your organization starts caring about those things too. Maybe it doesn't when you get there, but you bring on a new business unit, things evolve, you grow, all of a sudden you might have some of those same concerns and needs, and you've kind of seen what other people wanted from it, and what has worked and not worked. So just makes you a little bit more well-rounded, I would say.
Interesting. How much of the CISO role would you say is being technical, and how much is about more communication, management, being on the business side?
I think that's really organizationally specific. There can be the wide range. I'm of the school that I think CISOs should have some technical background, but I know that not all organizations need that if they have especially when they're really large and they have a really deep bench on the technical side. But a lot of people miss the soft skills and the business side of the CISO piece that is really a lot more important than they think. They kind of downplay it and think that it's something that everyone can learn when it's not something everyone's necessarily great at, because you're only as good as what you can communicate. You're only as good as what you can get approved. You're only as good as, the kind of the tools you can tell your company and convince them that we need to invest in these. And if you don't get those, it doesn't really matter if you can technically set it up if you don't get it bought for you in the first place. And if you don't get buy-in from your organization and people are just doing whatever they want, then all the policies and procedures you wrote really aren't that useful either. So you really should have a mix of both. And I know that's a really political answer, but in my experience, there is no right recipe. But I will say people think that they can be just technical and it'll work out. And in some orgs that are really engineering led, that may work, but the knowing the business and how to support the business is a skill that people, maybe when they go to school to get a master's or a PhD kind of learn, but they don't really get taught that well and just coming up through the ranks. And that's where the disconnect is, when they want to get from like VP to CISO or something, is understanding the kind of the business side and how to kind of relate to the other peers.
Interesting. How does your day-to-day look like right now? Like in terms of your time management between team things, management, actually doing technical things?
Yeah, it varies kind of depending on, what what fire is burning and what part of the world. But in general, I wake up pretty early because I work out early to try and start the day. But I do check Slack and alerts first thing to see if there's any issues over the night, so I can address them, from my organization before the market opens. So if there's any sort of issue, I've got a couple hours to fix it, before anything, is kind of really a concern. So I get up, check in with my people overseas, make sure there's nothing on fire, go work out, come back. And while I'm eating my breakfast, I'll start looking at emails, from vendors and outside people and other things, anything I respond to. Anything internally from my legal department that we've been working on, I'll go through that. And then I try and start my day updating and cleaning up any sort of documentation or processes or procedures or diagrams that we're working on for any projects that day. I feel like getting that done early, just because it's not the most fun activity. If you do it later in the day when you're tired and your brain's not working, it's just really painful. While I have the most energy, I kind of knock out the more mundane tasks and I leave the kind of the funner technical things where I'm tinkering for later in the day. And that kind of works for me. I have a fair amount of set kind of meetings here and there I have to do for the business, but a fair amount of my time is responding to things and alerts and doing investigations that are kind of ad hoc throughout the day. And people will get these random phishing emails and, sometimes it's a phishing email. Sometimes it's just a really badly formatted email that is a real invoice and you have to figure it out and you can't just tell people to ignore things that look weird. So I'll work with different teams in the finance. They'll send me over anything that looks kind of oddly not perfect. And I'll give them the green light, like, yeah, this is a real invoice. We actually have to pay this. But I'd rather have them do that than make any poor choices. So I'm fine helping out in that realm. But it's a little more reactive during the day, depending on, again, what kind of alerts are coming in, what your WAF, what your EDR is, firing off, what your cloud security tools telling you. That'll dictate a huge part of your day. And when it's quiet, you can kind of focus on your more long-term projects.
Interesting. You say that the first thing is kind of making sure nothing's on fire. What if something is on fire? How does that day look like?
You kind of go into incident response mode. You have your incident response plan. You have a checklist of things of who you're communicating depending on the scenario, and you just kind of go into autopilot. Actually, it's for people that haven't had to do any sort of incident response, it's kind of stressful to think about. But if you've done it a couple times and you've been through a couple different fire drills, it's not as bad as you think because you've established a process. You know who you're going to communicate with. You're going to set up a bridge. Who needs to get invited. Who needs to be alerted. And you kind of just go through those steps and you dig into it. And, I would say half the time it's not as bad as it looked to begin with, but, sometimes it's not great. And, but as long as you have an established process to respond to it, it feels a little bit less daunting. Anyone that doesn't really have that, and then all of a sudden something bad happens like that first thing in the morning, it there could be some anxiety, I would assume, where, oh, great, who's going to be able to respond? Are they going to be up? Are they even expecting this? Like, I've been in situations like that, especially in the managed security side, where something was going wrong, and I'm like, oh my God, like, who's even going to respond at 7 a.m. from this organization? I'm like, am I going to even hear anything? So I've definitely been there, but now that I've kind of a little bit more control over it, I like to, again, set it up for success where I don't have to use that part of my brain as much. I can just kind of go through a checklist and say, step A, do this, and then worry about step B, and then worry about step C, and not get overwhelmed by the weight of the moment.
Amazing. Do you remember any specific incident, obviously without names or companies or anything, but do you remember any specific incident that was like where you did feel, whoa, like, what am I doing now?
Yeah, so early on in my career, when I was more of a network engineer, and I was um, setting up, Fortinet specifically for this one project, um, we had a small business, and when I was in the middle of configuring, I forget what it was specifically, but it was something around a network interface. Uh, the firewall rebooted, and it rebooted without an external IP, which is the IP I needed to connect to it in the first place to fix it. So it rebooted into a state where I couldn't log back into it remotely. And so I was like, oh my God. So I had to, yeah. And this was a company that didn't necessarily have an IT person. So I had to like call and talk someone through connecting via cable to this firewall and configuring the external, interface for me to connect and fix it. And while that was happening, they were like hard down. They weren't getting emails. They weren't getting, like, nothing was coming in. It was like not a good situation for them either. So I just remember going like, oh, like,
What a
yeah,
stressful
yeah, that was
situation.
super stressful because, talking through someone who's not an IT expert how to set up the cable and via command line reset an interface. It's not super complicated. You can look up the commands exactly from Fortinet. It's not like the end of the world, but just getting someone to do it over the phone. Early on in my career, I remember being like, I was freaking out. I was, what, I've made some poor choices if this is where I've ended up.
Sounds like an experience that built you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've learned not to tinker with network interfaces without some sort of backup IP or something, means of connection remotely.
Interesting. It's interesting that specifically that case was like sort of your fault, but have you ever um do you ever feel like a bad cop? Like you have to make sure that no one's doing anything wrong and just like being in charge?
Yeah, I think the industry has moved away from bad cop, and we're moving more towards the carrot than the stick, because we've learned that, beating on, telling the user they're the weakest link and they're the biggest problem hasn't really helped the problem. And when in reality is what we want people to not be afraid of us, and even if they do screw up, know that they can come to us for help. Because what will happen is, if you're the bad cop, if they click on something, they'll be like, well, nothing's blowing up, so maybe it's okay. And they're just going to not kind of say anything. Whereas I'd rather someone say, you know what, I think I screwed up. I would rather just call Chris and know one way or another. And so I kind of move towards that. But you're right. There is kind of I would say, an educational piece where the CISO or any sort of security leader needs to understand he's there to help. You know, yes, we know what's good and bad, but we're there to help people. We're there to help the business. So anyone who calls up with any sort of problem, they should get, I'm here to help from me. And anything short of that, I think, is not really conducive for a good, healthy relationship. So, and the more you do that, the more things they bring to you, where they're like, you know what, I don't know if this is a thing, Chris, but maybe this kind of looked weird, and you'll find you have these kind of champions in different parts of the business, and your finance department, your developers, that start doing things a little bit more than they would have, because they know if if they need help with it, that you're there to help them. So they go, you know what, I was thinking about doing this. Is this a good idea security wise, Chris? Yeah, it is. This, or no, that we wouldn't do it like that. But if they're too scared to have the conversation, you're just kind of missing out.
Amazing. How would you say you divide your attention between educating the people and putting controls to make sure no mistakes are done, with no bad intentions, but just silly decisions?
Sure. I think front loading people with the training is important, and explaining why we do things is kind of the key. Having guardrails is important. And I kind of adhere to an extreme ownership type of mentality, for familiar with Jocko Willink. And that is, if any of my people screw up, it is my fault. I didn't have the right guardrails. I didn't have the right training. I didn't explain right. I didn't give them whatever it was. I screwed up. So I already have that mentality. So I go into any of my employees, training them to do what they need to do, like giving them the tools so they understand it. And then if I have guardrails, I really want them to understand why we have those guardrails, so they don't think it's just some arbitrary rule because I said so. And if they understand why, they're going to adhere to it, and they're going to not want to have the problems that I've had, and the reasons why I put guardrails there, because I've gone through things where external IPs disappear and you have to talk on someone through the phone to reconnect it, and we don't want everyone else to have to go through that. So I would say it's important to front load your people, give them as much training up front on their tools as possible. I like to set aside time weekly, especially kind of like Friday afternoons, so they can kind of not get into messy problems going into the weekend, but sit there and go through and stay professionally, adept at our tools. Learn new things. There's constantly release notes going on some of our tools, new features. We want people to be familiar with that and to take advantage of that, and not have a security incident where the vendor's like, oh, we had a new thing that detects that and you guys just hadn't turned it on yet. You don't want to be in those scenarios. So you got to it's constant education. Even myself, I'm working on my PhD right now because there's always more I can know. There's always things I can learn. And there's never a moment where you've figured it all out. Anyone who thinks that they're an expert and they figured it all out in this field is full of crap, because there's infinite amount of things you can know, and every day more is added to it. So there's always something you can learn.
How do you learn? I mean, it's one thing when you're the expert and you're educating other people, but how do you yourself find the newest information, the new things that are happening? It's a field that's changing so fast. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you keep up?
I'll be honest. I think things like social media help. I think Twitter, especially the Twitter community for InfoSec, there's drama there sometimes, and people, go on tangents. But a lot of people are doing some real interesting work, and they'll be like, "Hey, I just found this new CVE that hasn't been published yet," or "Hey, there's this weird thing going on with Microsoft tools where you can roll back the version of it, and then you can exploit it however you want." There's really a lot of up to date. And whenever there's an issue, like when the CrowdStrike thing first hit, Twitter is the first place you probably saw that. I'm in a CISO group for local to Dallas, like a chat group, and things like that also kind of come up, and people are constantly sharing, so that helps. But yeah, surprisingly, as much as think social media is not the best thing for society, when it comes to InfoSec, there's a load of information there that I think is super useful. LinkedIn, not as, I wouldn't say it's timely, but there's also from the business side and maybe more from the strategic side, some really good insights that I would say my colleagues and peers also are putting out consistently. So I always take the time to read that and kind of stay up to date with certain people that I feel like are always trying to put out quality content.
Do you feel like the news that end up on the more popular media is usually correct? Like when there's a breach or something like that, like how much do you trust that?
Not always. Yeah. What you're alluding to is right. Sometimes it's just the most popular accounts that kind of are the loudest, and they're not always right. But I think there's enough people that look and talk about these things that you can start to kind of decide and see. And people, they'll provide evidence and screenshots and things saying, especially using the CrowdStrike example, there was a couple different analyses on what happened with that, the file, the library file that they added that caused it to malfunction. There was what seemed like a pretty technical analysis that first came out, but a bunch of people came out afterwards and said, no, that's just not correct, and they did their own. So you do have to take everything with a grain of salt. But I feel like as you're reading through or kind of listening, if you know something about it, you can start kind of smelling that this person's making some reaches or made some wrong assumptions, or they're just looking for some, reactions and content. But like I said, if you follow people that aren't about that and are about the truth, which is kind of, what I always seek out, then you kind of know what you're getting from them. And they'll always caveat it with, look, this is just my opinion. This is the way I see it. So.
Amazing. What do you think is the biggest problem in cybersecurity right now?
I think somewhere about 5 years ago, there was a problem with maybe it was even longer, 5-10 years ago. There was a problem with kind of the whole mentality around cybersecurity where we really burned out there was a lot of people that wore a lot of hats. You were the vulnerability management guy, and you were the AppSec guy, and you were the network security guy. You wore all these hats, and there was an expectation that you should also be raising up the next generation. And those people probably would have done that and wanted to, but they were overworked, overburdened, and couldn't do that. So they wanted they wanted people to come in and help them that already knew the job, because they were burnt out. And so we have this kind of disconnect where, we have all these jobs, but not enough qualified people. Well, because the people that need help in certain circumstances they literally don't have the time to sit there and train them. It's just not something they always have time to do. They're understaffed, they're working multiple things, and they're just saying, look, all I want is for someone to take 2 of these off my plate. And if I have to sit there and train them on everything that I know on it, then I'm not going to be able to do the other 3 jobs I have to do. So I feel, and I've spoken probably many times on this, that we need to help people going through the education academia route of learning to get practical experience. I got my master's, but they didn't, except for a couple teachers that had access to like Palo Alto Networks firewalls, there wasn't a whole technical side that allowed people to learn like what you really have to do day 1 and day 2. And I feel like if we focused on that a little bit more, a little bit less about kind of the, in theory how it works, people could show up with just a degree and be able to do some work, day 1. So I think we should have them working on the actual tools at the universities and boot camps. Have them certified from Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, Cisco, CrowdStrike, Splunk, whatever it is. Like, get them the early certifications in that, get them the ability to do those things while they're, earning their degrees. And then they can help an organization that has that tool in their stack pretty early on. But most people, most educators, push like Learning Security Plus, and I'll be honest, it's a great foundational kind of certification, but it doesn't really tell me that the person can do anything in particular, day 1 anyway. So I'm a big fan of that, but I also feel like the vendors need to make all that free, and they need to, all this stuff they give their partners and their professional services for training, they need to open that up to universities and give all the students free access to all of their tiers so that they can come out ready to actually support these tools.
Cool. What would you say to someone who is looking to get into security from another field, or someone who is just starting out and wants to advance and like take this as their journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing they should do is talk to some people that have been in the field for a minute, so they understand what they're getting into first and foremost, what it really is. I think a lot of people get excited about the idea of being like a hacker, just because that's cool and sexy. And the reality is that not a lot of that is going on. There's pen testing and there's red teams, and they do exist, but that's not the 50,000 jobs in cybersecurity they're talking about. And that's not, I'm not saying it's not a valid career. It's perfectly great. And a lot of those people end up moving into product and because they understand things at a whole different level. So they progress fine into other fields. But no one really wants to hire someone that's never really been around a computer, but like took a couple courses and then say, oh yeah, come in and just hack our environment. And that's just not really how it works. So they need to have a little bit of realistic expectations, but also understand like what they think their strengths are, what they think their weaknesses are, and get some people to kind of point them in the right direction to get the additional training or education on things they're not great at. And they have to be aware that you kind of have to have a tinkering mentality. There's a lot of trial and error in this job. We all think we write the perfect query, the perfect use case, the perfect, shell script. And then it doesn't work and you have to go back and try it again. So anyone who kind of does something and then quits because it doesn't work the first time, it's just not going to really work out super great in cybersecurity, because you end up redoing things quite a few times until it gets, this one's too noisy, this one's too quiet, so this one's just right. You kind of got to have that Goldilocks mentality.
Interesting. What do you think if we go into the other side of, if you have the people who are super starting out, the people who are super experienced, the CISOs? Is there anything you see that they're missing or that you think they should be paying more attention to?
I honestly, I think the current crop of CISOs that I deal with are much better than kind of what organizations had before. Organizations before had people that were either really technical that made it up the ranks but weren't especially adept at the business side, or people that were just really good business leaders and kind of missed the technical side and kind of had to rely on their SMEs for that kind of piece. Now I see people that are pretty well balanced. I feel like they're the ones that are really kind of making it through. I don't know if I can really critique what other people really need to kind of work on right now, because like I said, I'm really seeing more well-balanced CISOs these days. The only thing I think is the mentality needs to change a little bit on, we need to remain constant learners and not think like, even if I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I've got it all figured out, because they're still getting hacked too, and it's not always the CISO's fault specifically, but at the end of the day, if you took that job and the whole, and he's charged with the security of the organization, it is, if something happens. So you kind of have the mentality that you don't know what you don't know. You got to constantly be looking for it. And, with changes with AI and things like that, we've got kind of some new threats evolving. And if you've kind of sat back and said, well, I've figured out this organization, I've got all my defenses up, I bought all the tools, all configured, you're just kind of on autopilot. You're just kind of waiting for a problem to happen, where you need to be a little bit more proactive now, because technology is constantly changing and the threats constantly changing, and they'll just start bypassing all your controls and recruiting your own developers to put stuff on your network behind your firewalls. And if you're not, thinking about the human aspect of it too, I bring up this example because ransomware, is a really lucrative business, and some researchers and some people that have dug into it have found that if all those fails with their phishing campaigns and their other techniques, they'll literally just seek out employees that they think are disgruntled and offer them a large amount of money to put things on the network that help them get in. And that's something that's really hard to defend against. You don't have the means of really monitoring their external communications, their own private emails, their Signal, anything like that. So, and these are people that are trusted with placement and access to our really sensitive systems. They're kind of, behind the firewalls, all that. And if they come in and especially if they're, coding, and they can add snippets, with backdoors and whatnot, that's really problematic and can really get past quite a few controls. So if you're not thinking about that as an aspect of it, that kind of insider threat piece, that I think that happens more often than people realize. It's really hard to detect. That was my former in Intel. That was my former world, and it almost never got caught. And I think a lot of people are kind of underestimating how much of that goes on.
Yeah. Wow. As you say that, I'm thinking like, I haven't heard about that a lot. And B, have you seen something like that actually play out ever?
I haven't seen it from like being on the victimized side. I was on the offensive side of that, and I've seen it work every single time. But there have been notes about this where North Korean employee was working at what organization? It was a security vendor, KnowBe4 or something like that. They can do that, especially with AI and VPN and deepfakes and all these things. They can start impersonating U.S. employees and getting jobs, even low-level jobs, and working their way up. So I'll have to go back and refresh my memory on that article, but that was fairly recently. And then things like that they're not the most common, and they are typically a nation state. But as these tools become more easy to access from the regular population, even low level hackers and script kiddies can have access to some of these tools.
Interesting. How much does AI concern you?
A lot, and
Redundant.
yeah, it concerns me a lot because the ability for it to dynamically change things that we're used to being static as part of our detection methodology was really worrisome. So we've got a lot of tools that check on hashes and check on IPs and check on reputations and all these things. And if you have the ability to dynamically change that so that every single executable has a different hash and environment, it's a pain in the ass to script that out. But with something like AI, you could have something like that work, And so all of a sudden, yeah, I found this malware, and then you go to threat hunt your environment to look for it in other places on your environment. You don't find it, but you don't know it's got a different hash on almost every different host or whatever. And so you're not, it's like things like that are really worrisome. And DDoS attacks, based on IPs, you can dynamically have IPs changing at an ease and speed at which we haven't quite seen before. So things like that, I haven't seen it fully deployed against anyone in a way that's worrisome yet, but knowing it's there and could be is concerning.
Interesting. What do you think are some of the main differences between the way cybersecurity used to be and the way it is right now?
I think a lot of organizations thought it made it an afterthought before. It's a non-revenue generating department, so it was like a luxury to have. Some companies didn't even have a CISO until they reached a certain point. Some didn't even have really a security guy. They had, IT guys that were kind of good at security. I think, between, initiatives to drive compliance around that, from whether it's organizational regulation or self-regulation, we've kind of pushed to be more proactive, and we've seen that there's value in being proactive and adding security early on. It's cheaper to embed it early than to try and add it on later. Companies have at least learned that. And I feel like CEOs and executives used to not maybe care about it quite as much, and because of unfortunately, all the events and all the organizations that have been disrupted, they are concerned about it now. And so they have questions and they seek out, advice from their experts. And so I feel like, CISOs in the field have been kind of brought to the table more and are taken a little bit more seriously than in the past. So I would say it's in a pretty positive place right now.
Interesting. What would you say is one thing that you learned throughout, your journey that you think anyone in security should know or think about?
That's a hard one. One thing. I'm gonna answer this differently, just because maybe a lot of people answer this the same way. I'm a big believer in things like intuition, and I feel like people have gut feelings, and we squash them down and we don't listen to them. And I'm going to be honest, when certain things are going on, and especially when I'm responding to incidents, I don't know if it's pattern recognition, but I get a gut feeling where I need to look for the right logs to find the answer, what system I need to go check on if there's issues. I really go with my gut and my instincts, because I feel like in the high stress moment, in the back of my mind, my brain's saying, we've seen this problem before, it's probably this, or this has happened before, and my conscious mind's worried about the stress of it, like what's good, it's going through all the panic mode stuff, and it's not thinking clearly. The back of my mind's going, go check your firewall logs, then go check, it's already kind of knows. And so you get that gut feeling, like learn to trust your instincts on it, and especially in times of stress, especially as you have more experience and you've been through these things, because through, again, like things like pattern recognition and just intuition, professionals, I think, they don't know why they know where the answer is, but they know where the answer is. Just go to it. You don't need to prove yourself that you know why. Just go and look. And if you're wrong, then you can move on. But 9 times out of 10, I feel people's gut feelings when they're kind of working those incidents is something that they should start trusting a little bit. Like, it's odd. I'll see an alert and I'll see an external IP, and I can kind of tell if it's bad or not. And it's weird. I don't know how to explain it. There's not a number combination. It's not, but I'll look at it and be like, I don't like it. I don't like this, or the hat, or the binary. They'll just be very basic bits of information. I'll get a gut feeling right off the bat, like, this one's not a good one. And you got to, go in and put it through your sandbox and some other things, or do some reputation. But sure enough, it's usually pretty close.
Interesting. Do you have a team?
Yes.
How does your team feel about the intuitions?
I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and what's funny is people will be like, "How did you know to go look at here to get the answer?" And you don't want to tell people, "Well, it just popped into my head that was the place to go." You kind of got to give them reasons. So I do explain things like, "Well, you know what? It's pattern recognition. I've been through 10 of these things before. I've been through 100 of these things before." I mentioned early on, if you work for an MSSP, an MDR, or anything where you're kind of customer facing, you're seeing, especially multiple customers, you're seeing a large amount of different attack vectors, of different alerts, different things, and you kind of see those problems as they come, and you start, again, creating patterns on what they look like. And so when it's your time later on, it kind of, again, you may not remember that exact incident, but your subconscious is like, I remember what this was, and it's going to kind of nudge you in that right direction. So I hate to tell them well, I'm just lucky, or I just kind of guessed, or I just had a feeling. It's, I say pattern recognition, but it's just something that, our brains collect a lot more information and do a lot more processing on the back end than we give them credit for. And you should use that as an advantage, and not, and learn when to trust it is what I actually start telling people working.
Perfect. I think it's so true for as soon as you have your experience in the field, you can't ignore those feelings.
I think people that are new have those feelings and they don't trust them, and so they don't do
really?
it. And yeah, I think some people just have some really natural intuition that's, I can't explain where it comes from. I think about hackers that don't have any formal training, but just think about, how would I break this? They're just, no one's broken this before. They're not following a pattern. They're coming up with in their head. It's an intuition. Something's telling them, I bet if I tell this certain module to do this, it's going to break it, and it's going to give me some sort of weird response. And then, and so those people are just, they have some sort of gift. Their brain was, formed a certain way, and they just have it. And it's hard when you don't have some sort of, I don't know, the degree or the pedigree to get people to understand that. So they have to show it with their work. But there's some people that have no formal training, that have just kind of been self-taught, that have figured out things that no one's even seen before yet. And I just think it's a marvel of the human mind.
Amazing. How much do you think, if you put it on a scale, how much is security a natural gift to 100% taught?
I think it'd be both. I think someone can have a natural gift in it, and I think anyone can learn it with the right amount of discipline and time. So I think you can have both scenarios. And I'm not one of those people that's blessed with just, the natural talent. I'm the one that had to do the reading and the working and do all that. So, but I see the people that are, smarter than me, that didn't have to do that. They're not working on their PhD or anything. And I would defer to them on certain things. So I think there's both for sure. It's just kind of, knowing what you're working with and trying to make the most of your strengths.
That's great. Is there anything that keeps you up at night as a CISO?
It's the unknown. It is the unknown. I mean, you set up what you think is going to be a secure environment. You set up what you think are going to be controls that are going to give you the alerts and the early warning systems. You do all these things, and you still don't know what you don't know. You don't know what got changed during a production push, what got left open. I mean, there, you can be as proactive as you want, but there's always that thought, today could be the day where my environment gets taken down. And you just gotta, like I said, have that mindset of, I've prepared for this. I've got, a plan if it happens. I don't lose a ton of sleep over it anymore. I just don't sleep a lot either.
That's a slightly disturbing response, but it's honest. Amazing. Okay, so I think I only have one last question. And thank you so much for coming on the show, by the way. This has been super informative. And I think that people can learn a lot, both from your mindset and from the actual things you said. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. So my last question kind of relates to that. What do you think is going to change from now to 2 years, 5 years, 10 years into the future, both for cybersecurity, but also for CISOs as a role?
Yeah, I think the technical side is going to get far more advanced. I think AI is going to become a force multiplier for the jobs we do. I don't know it's going to necessarily replace a ton of people. It may push them to be kind of different jobs in the field, but it's going to be a force multiplier, and we're going to be able to do a lot more than we're doing now. So I think it's going to, so the attack complications are going to increase, but the defensive techniques are also going to increase. So we're going to still be at kind of a stalemate. I think ultimately from the economic standpoint, we're always at a disadvantage on the offensive side. So we're going to probably maintain the status quo of the adversary always having a little bit of an edge. But I feel like, I think we're going to keep pace with adversaries with the complications. And I think we're going to leverage AI, ML and some new advancements to, improve overall. I mean, there will always be hacks. There'll always be, a human way to get around things. There'll always be things that happen, but I think like right now, a lot of hacks happen with the basics, old passwords that weren't, turned off from old file. I think we'll see a lot less of that because we'll have tools that detect that. We'll have tools that identify that. It'll, we already have a lot of things like that make it harder to have some sort of, old service accounts that aren't functional. We have a lot of things on now that say, hey, this hasn't been used. This has got too many permissions. Go change that. So we're already headed there. I think it's going to just happen quicker. And I don't know if we're going to see more vendors or more consolidation, but we're going to see a lot more capabilities. And I think we're going to see some pretty cool technology around behavioral analytics of users so that we can really identify, like the user identity space is really going to expand. That's one thing that as long as you have a login and a password, and it works and you have the MSA, it's you. I think there's going to be other ways we're going to start adding some context to that to make it a little bit harder for just credentials and keys to get you in. And I think that's going to be a good thing.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. It was a pleasure.